Hospital Dietetics, and that was followed by an honors degree and a master's degree in psychology. Her doctoral research focused on bulimia, exploring the intricate links between physical and mental health. She is registered with the Health Professions Council of South Africa and trained as a mediator with conflict dynamics. Her extensive studies encompass astrology, Reiki, and various healing modalities. And with our theme of going towards integrative health, we are definitely looking at embracing all modalities in healing. She is a prominent figure in professional ethics and has co-authored books and articles on psychology, ethics, and cyber savvy practices. Dr. Hannetjie conducts workshops worldwide addressing topics such as nutrition, stress, and mindfulness, and contributes regularly to journals and media on positive aging and ethical living. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Hannetjie, and I'm going to mute my mic, and I'm really looking forward to hearing this presentation.
Thank you, Jackie, and good evening, everybody. It's a huge pleasure for me to be here, and one of my favorite things in the world is to build puzzles. And so what I chose that topic specifically because there are just so many interesting pieces of this whole cancer picture. And what I'm hoping to do this evening is to present some very integral pieces of the puzzle, and hopefully together we will be able to form more of a picture, certainly in terms of the causation, and then obviously to get to the treatment and the management as well. So I believe that you've had some previous mind-body connections, and it's definitely the lens through which we want to look at the cancer picture too, that of the mind-body and the context within which we grow up and live. So cancer within a certain ecosystem. Okay, there seems to be a bit of a delay on the slide. There we go. So the body-mind awareness is an ancient concept. Socrates said you can't split the mind from the body, and Hippocrates would rather know what sort of a person has a disease than what sort of a disease a person has. So that our medical forefathers have certainly started with the right footing. And I think very often part of our problem is that we forget the mind and the family and the context connection and focus maybe too much on medical things. Whereas if one gets a wider picture, you can sometimes do interventions that may not necessarily seem logical, but are very useful. So some of the puzzle pieces that I want to present this evening are, first of all, just basic premises on which this talk is built. I want to share with you some really important references up front. And the main area there is for you to see how much correspondence there is from such a diverse group of authors. We'll be talking about the subconscious mind, stress and the general adaptation response, cell danger, maladaptive stress response, very much also about the timing of the problem, and then more around the symbolic value of symptoms and what cancer means in people's lives. There's a section on escalation of pathology, secondary gain, looking at decoding some of the symptoms, and then some of the personality patterns that have come through in the research. The psychological process of an illness was described many years ago already by the Simontons, and that seems to be pretty much still valid. We'll be looking at the process of recovery, want to make special mention of mindfulness, and then introduce you to an app that I think is the best thing since sliced bread. So the basic premises are that mind and body are inseparable, and that illness and health need to be understood within the subjective context of life histories and the social and emotional patterns of human beings. There is a massive amount of work about how stress is mainly stressful because of what we think about what's happening. And so for some people, something like a divorce is a relief, and for others, it's the biggest catastrophe that has ever happened to them. So our subjective experience is really a huge influence in the development of our problems. The relationships that we have, starting from parents to partners to work relationships, all of those have their share of input. And the general contention is that people become ill because of their lives. And so some of these issues may be a bit different from what you've experienced. And I usually tell people, if things don't fit for you right now, put them in file 13 and maybe inspect them again a little bit later. And then the basic premise here, furthermore, is that the body has an innate wisdom. And if we can help to understand that, it can be employed towards transformation and health. So these references come from a wide field. So they involve psychological, social, spiritual, and physiological contexts, and their influences on health and disease. And so these are some of my favorites. Thor Dietlefsen is a spiritual psychologist. He talks about the healing power of illness, and you'll see me use his work quite a lot. Davidson and Goleman are very well known in the psychological field, and they did this Science of Meditation is a magnificent work where they did meta-analyses of many of the meditation projects that have gone before. And just in a nutshell, they are incredibly positive and show many tremendous advantages psychologically and physiologically from mindfulness and meditation. John Kabat-Zinn, in my opinion, is pretty much the father of mindfulness. I really recommend this book for catastrophe living. He got the title from Zorba, the Greek, who said that he was asked whether he got married and had family and children. And he said, yes, the full catastrophe. So very much his mindfulness-based stress reduction. And in fact, the work that they did was not to cure anything, but they got the most unbelievable results in terms of cures whilst working on other things. Gabor Mate is very prominent at the moment. He says that many of the physical issues are the body's way of saying no. He talks a lot about understanding the stress-disease connections. And the very last reference here is a little YouTube clip of him talking about the dangers of being too nice. And you'll see how that aspect is very involved in the cancer personality as well. Carolyn Mace, many of you may know her, very much about spiritual issues relating to health and wellness. The Candace Pert, one of the first to talk about the physical aspects and the physical changes and neuropeptides from emotions and how they affect the body. This one is one of my favorite references for the talk. It's a decade of research. It's a fantastic volume, I think it's 178 pages of research in psychoneuroimmunology. And what I loved about this is that this is a lot more modern, but it seems to echo many of the contentions that we had from the other authors. Simonton is one of the first that I became aware of working with guided imagery in overcoming cancer, working with the treatment, working with the subconscious, and getting improved results from their method. And then just a recent South African author on stress and just some updated information around the whole stress process from him. So the psychoneuroimmunology, and in fact, people think that it actually ought to be endocrinology in there as well, would then be the ways that the psyche, the mind and emotions and the content of emotions profoundly interacts with the body's nervous system and how both of those in turn form an essential link with our immune defenses. So this is also Gabor Mate, but that is the basis of psychoneuroimmunology. It's also a theme that runs through the work that we've read, and from in the next one, from Thor Dietlefsen, just another way of looking at the problem. So he basically says the body isn't ill or healthy because it expresses messages from the consciousness. And so I found this rather fascinating. The body does nothing of itself, as anybody can confirm for himself by looking at a corpse. So his view is that it's the consciousness which represents us with messages manifest in the body. And if we understand those messages, we can get the feedback and go on with our developmental processes. And then also from him, when bodily functions are working together harmoniously, we talk about that as health. And if a function goes wrong, it disturbs the harmony, and then what we refer to as illness. Candace Pert was very explicit around emotions that can transform the body, either creating disease or healing it, maintaining health or undermining it. And what is so interesting is during our, before the talk started, Jackie and I were chatting, and fear is definitely one of those that has a massive influence on how the disease will progress in the body. And this is not just cancer, it's pretty much any disease. And the whole concept of fear is probably one of the greatest intruders into the health process. So one of the very important emotions to manage, and very specifically also then through the mindfulness that we'll talk about a little bit later. So from her, but also from the others, the body is the unconscious mind. Repressed traumas caused by overwhelming emotion can be stored in any part of the body. Now, this view is very much also shared by people like Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine, who work with stress and who actually work with the body physically to get the stress released from the physical body and get the energy flow going properly again. So just from Pert, the body-mind is an integrated information system. Every emotion is a physical event in the body, and all systems, the immune, endocrine, nervous, and the brain, are interlinked and interdependent. Now, this every emotion is a physical event in the body is actually quite a fascinating concept. And for those of you who know kinesiology, you will know that when people have negative thoughts or fearful thoughts, it seriously affects their body's energy level, to the point where they can get depressed if they keep mulling around these difficult issues. So there, from all sides, we are finding these influences that affect the energy and then also the capacity to defend. Since emotional expression is always tied to a specific flow of peptides in the body, the chronic suppression of emotions results in a massive disturbance of the psychosomatic network. This factor seems also to relate very much to the upbringing of children. Gabor Mate talks about it quite a lot, but you will see when we look at the personality patterns of people with cancer, that they very often as children, they already learn to not honor their own emotions. They tend to protect their parents. They would rather not, or they're not taught how to vent their emotions properly, but very often they hold back and hold in to protect a parent or someone in the family who is struggling. My favorite is the subconscious mind, and particularly because it is just so irrational and takes everything that we do literally. So we have to be enormously careful about how we speak, because if one repeats things, if you repeat, for example, if you repeat a fear thought often, the subconscious will follow that instruction and make that issue come true for you. So ultimately, the subconscious mind thinks that it is helping our survival, and it will do pretty much anything to see to it that we survive. So it has a positive intention for us, but not necessarily a positive outcome. And I want to give an example from my past work. When I was working a lot with dietetics, and especially with people with weight problems, we often see the weight as protecting people, protecting their relationships. And when they learn how to be more assertive, to protect their boundaries, to say what they want, don't want, they don't actually need the weight to protect them any longer. It's also very often seen in people who've been abused or have been sexually traumatized, that the body thinks, let me protect you, let me make you unattractive. So the intention is good, but the outcome isn't necessarily good. And that is when we talk about the solution becoming the problem. And our job is then to get better, more current solutions that do not involve problematic areas in and of themselves. The subconscious mind also generalizes furiously. So if something is a little bit bad, it makes it really bad. It kind of doesn't understand gray areas. It's either life or death. And so it takes things very literally and tends to catastrophize. So the self-talk and the way that one describes the problem, or you describe it to others, or how they respond to you, will massively influence what the subconscious is going to make happen for you. You may be familiar with the concept of shadow. It's those good and bad qualities in ourselves that we don't really recognize. We usually project them onto other people and then blame them for having those qualities. There's some very interesting work on that, but the shadow lives in the subconscious mind, particularly because those qualities aren't recognized by us. So a big part of what we want to do is to bring those qualities into the light, so that one can decide how you're going to work them. Because, for example, if a lot of anger is trapped in the subconscious, there's a whole lot of energy that's required to keep it down. And that anger may well be necessary to put up resistance in the outside world. And so once that anger is mobilized properly, it can help us rather than having to be kept down and draining our energy in that way. So subconscious is not logical, doesn't confine itself to rational explanation. It will go with what it thinks that you want from it. Here's how it is particularly relevant for us tonight. Communicates to us by symptoms, dreams, symbols, and metaphors. And especially the dream work and the symptom work can be so interesting. And very often, especially around symptoms, people are inclined to deny initially what the authors say that the symptoms could mean, particularly because that information is in the subconscious and we're not aware of it. But if one plays with those thoughts a little bit and you entertain their hypotheses, sometimes the communication comes through and the blockage in the system can release. So another important point, the subconscious does not distinguish between fact, fear, or fantasy. And so if we have a negative fantasy, it's going to do that as a self-fulfilling prophecy for you. So it really is important to keep in mind where you allow your mind to go. And in fact, if one does find that you go along a difficult track, got to stop that immediately and work it back and say, no, stop that negative fantasy, what I actually want, and give the positive view there. You'll probably be familiar with the something that's called the negativity ratio, where we need a whole lot of positive input to counter a negative thought or criticism. And many of you will have noticed this, that you can do a whole lot right, but then one person criticizes you about one little thing that you didn't do, and that's the thing that preoccupies your mind. So the focus on negativity started as a survival mechanism, because you can imagine if you're walking in a forest somewhere or even in an open space, you need to check out what is wrong, what is going to pounce, what's going to have you for breakfast, and how are you going to survive. So the negativity is good for survival, but it's very not good for thriving and for flourishing. The negative messages or repetitive messages we need to be very careful for. And here I usually, for those of you who are old enough to remember the Cremora ad, I want to ask you, why do you remember the Cremora ad? And everybody can kind of imagine this guy standing at the fridge in his gown saying, it's not inside, it's on top. Now, we didn't want to know that stuff, but it was kind of catchy and a little bit funny, and there was massive repetition. And so what I'm saying is that whether it's good or bad repetition, it's going to go into the subconscious. And there again, we can have a really good influence by focusing on the positive and working towards what we want rather than what we don't want. So next, we're going to talk a bit more about stress. And we're talking about emotional or physiological stress. I said earlier, it's about the interpretation and the meaning that we assign to the situation. And so if you think that something is bad, it's going to have a whole different effect on your system, as opposed to if you see it as a challenge or something that you can overcome. Stress responses are intended to protect us, but that is more so for an acute stress than for a chronic stress. So our current lifestyles are really not very favorable for us to cope with stress, because the kinds of chronic stress that we deal with don't resolve. If you imagine having trouble at work with a boss, or having trouble in the family with a family member, that is ongoing, as opposed to an acute stress that the ancestors had, where they had to run away from something that was threatening to eat them. And so if you run and you're able to get to safety, or climb into a tree, or put a rock in front of the cave opening, then the stress is released and it's over. But with a chronic stress, there's never that release. And that is very much part of the negative effect, as we'll see a bit more further on. The Hannetjie is one of the main stress researchers that we still refer to. And his definition is that stress is the non-specific response of the body to any demand or perceived threat. And this is the important thing. It can be even a positive thing, something that you've chosen, but it requires the body to adapt and therefore takes its toll on you. The other that is important to remember is that emotions are not abstract, disembodied feelings. They possess chemical and physical components, and these are funded by chemicals from our food and from what we put into our bodies. And those nutrients need to be replaced regularly. Otherwise, one runs on empty and then come into serious problems, as I will describe just now in the general adaptation syndrome. So something that people very often forget is that the more stress you have, the more nutrients your body will require just to keep functioning. And one of the paradoxical things there is that very often when people are stressed, they don't eat well, or they reach for rubbish food, or they smoke a lot more. And so they almost then exacerbate the stress by draining nutrients rather than adding in. And unless the nutrients are replenished, the system will break down progressively. So our job is to deal with the drains and to see if we can lighten the load and then improve their health behaviors in general. Sally described the stress process rather well. And when one looks at this graph, you will see that that fine line in the middle there is kind of one's normal level of stress resistance. So this would be low resistance, high resistance, the capacity to deal with stress. And obviously on the horizontal axis would be the duration of the stress. So what happens when a stressor occurs, it's as if one's coping dips for a while, kind of in alarm reaction, but then the body mobilizes resources. And we do go into kind of an overdrive where we think, oh my goodness, this is wonderful, I've got it made, we are coping with this. But meanwhile, one uses much, much more than you would normally require. So all of this has to be funded from reserve. And when I do the retirement work, we work with 4 portfolios. So it's not just finances, it's also physical, nutritional reserve. It is emotional reserve. It is social reserve. So it's all those reserves in our environment that are important. And then if one is infinitely wealthy, like Christina Onassis, maybe this won't bother you, especially, but none of us is that physically. And so sooner or later, the reserves give in, and then one gets to a breakdown phase. And so the exhaustion sets in, the reserves are depleted, and in that exhausted place, there's very often a physical breakdown. And so we want to do our level best to stay in that functioning place and to keep furnishing the nutrients that are required there. So reserve is key in all areas, but adaptive energy may well be limited. A factor that I'm sure you are very aware of is that stress can suppress the immune system. Now, what the researchers find is that illness is a lot more likely to occur after stressful events, especially cumulative stresses. And that kind of makes sense because of the wearing out of the reserves that we spoke about just now. Stress may predispose to illness, but coping skills and thought patterns influence the outcome. So there, an intervention is quite possible. And in fact, I didn't put her up as a reference, but there's a lovely book that Kelly McGonigal wrote called The Upside of Stress, where she talks about when the stressors, some of them can be seen as challenges and opportunities for growth, they actually don't even have the physical negative effects to the same extent that they would otherwise have had. Modern life requires us to constantly override our body's responses to stress, creating a constant state of overdrive. Now, this is really important because those negative effects build up. And when they're not released, the body goes into a kind of a trauma state. So it's also one of the reasons why they reckon that exercise can be so useful, because it's almost then as if the exercise can mobilize the stress hormones and get rid of that accumulation that otherwise would be so problematic. And then how stress would suppress the immune system. Several mechanisms are mentioned, especially changes in hormone levels, the effect that the stress has on chronic inflammation, an increased production of abnormal cells. There are cancers coming in. And then some of you may not know the cell danger response, but I will speak about that in a short while. Just want to show you a bit more about the cumulative stress and the timing of the problem. These researchers, 2 psychiatrists, Thomas Holmes and Richard Roy, they were looking at the effect of stress on their clients and on the health of their clients. And they developed this scale, which is referred to as the social readjustment rating scale, or just the Holmes and Ray scale, where they assigned a stress value, like an importance value, to events. Now, I just took out a few of the events. It's a much longer scale. But basically, what they say is that these experiences, whether they're good or bad, demand that we adapt. And because of that, there's it takes it out of the nervous system. And they found that when people have a relatively low cumulative value there, only about 9% of them experience illness within a year or two. But the higher the scores go, the more people experience quite a serious illness after the accumulation of a number of stress factors. And they, in their research, if the scores went over 300, there was an 80% chance of serious illness within 2 years. It's also one of the reasons that we say to people, don't do all your life changes in one go. If you retire, don't move and lose all your family and friends and all of those things in one go, because you can see that stopping work and changes in living conditions and changes of residence and so on make quite a big accumulation there. And then there are also the things like daily hassles and minor irritations that quickly add to these scores. I'm very excited about this work. To me, it's quite new. The researcher is Robert Navio. There's quite a lot that you will find on YouTube talks that he does. But basically, this cell danger response is a universal response to environmental threat or injury. And it happens in 3 stages. There's an alarm stage, there's a defense stage, and then there's a repair or remodeling. And then it has to switch off and the body has to take a different pathway to get to healing. But when something goes wrong in those one or more of these phases, the signal to switch off does not happen. And it's as if the nervous system gets hooked into a low energy phase. There's a lot of work that he does about the mitochondria. For those of you who understand the mitochondria well, really fascinating, because the ATP inside the mitochondria has different function from that outside, so it becomes really quite complicated. But my bottom line from this is that this cell danger response remains stuck in a repeat loop that blocks healing. And so this is what he proposes as very much the low energy states that you see in things like chronic fatigue, but also in chronic diseases where there's low energy states and the body just really is struggling to recover and to repair. And here's the really important thing. This signal of safety comes from the parasympathetic nervous system and the vagus nerve. And only when a cell perceives safety can it heal completely. And so that safety we can create by some of the mindfulness responses, by some of the breathing, and working with the work that Kabat-Zinn did so brilliantly. The chronic stress response and the maladaptive stress response are all kind of in cahoots with the cell danger response. So a chronic stress response activates cell danger, and then, as I alluded to earlier, it gets stuck in a low energy state, a kind of a fatigue state. The maladaptive stress response is a chronic state of sympathetic nervous system activation, even when you are in a safe environment. So it's that building up of the trauma, not being able to switch off and get it out of the system. And again, healing can't take place unless the person feels safe and the body registered safety. Only a calm nervous system can trigger a healing response, and then the one can eat, the reproductive processes work well, you sleep well, digestion is good. And so that is part of the focus, how to get that parasympathetic nervous system to get activated and the sympathetic to relax a bit. Right, now on to the symptoms themselves. So many of my references here share these ideas that symptoms are the body's way of telling us that something in our life is out of balance. And quite frankly, there is very little communication that we have with the subconscious other than that. So if we learn to understand dreams, we can very often get an idea of what one's soul thinks is wrong. So we look at a symptom as a signal that draws attention and awareness to itself. So by interpreting it, we can find the meaning associated with it. And it's pretty much like a light coming on in your car. You're not just going to cut the wire and forget about the light, because you know that there's going to be danger down the line and possible breakdown. So if we need to kind of, oops, what happened there now? The symptoms need to be understood as a warning. The symptom can also be seen as a teacher, helping us to take responsibility for the growth of our consciousness. And it can be seen as a friend, pretty much the next, as like the previous one, to help us to see what's lacking and to look at what we need to change in our environment, especially to make things easier. Its nudges can be gentle, but become harsher the longer we maintain our ignorance, or they call it denial. So we look then at how the pathology tends to escalate. And John Kabat-Zinn spoke of a very interesting case example that he had here. This one executive that he was working with, very much a type A personality, very driven, very punctual, kind of a bit OCD, who started getting headaches at work, and then the headaches escalated, and then he developed an ulcer. And it was only when he had a heart attack that he really came to a bit of a standstill and was able to assess his life and look at the value of what he was doing. So the escalation goes from thoughts, wishes, fantasies, kind of psychological phenomena, all the way down to chronic and incurable conditions. Obviously, when one dies, your chance of dealing with it in this life are over. But some of these authors reckon that these problems, and I must say I share that view, that the problems, if they're not dealt with here, will have to be dealt with in future incarnations. And it's, to me, it's pretty simple. It's like not passing a subject at varsity and having to repeat it the next year. I'd really rather not do that and get the work over as much as possible. And then Detlefsen specifically also says they think that congenital issues may relate to old areas. But now someone might say that these are the Huja Kapuja, so we can stop there if you like. But be interesting to see how it escalates. This is something that is really important. We believe that behavior that is rewarded will continue, and behavior that is not rewarded can't continue. And attention is one of the best rewards for behavior. Now, if one, and it starts with children, if they're sick and one makes a massive fuss of the sickness, they think, oh, the way to get mommy or daddy to pay attention is just to get sick. So we need to be very careful how we pay attention, because some things can't be ignored, but we also need to be very mindful of the fact that we need to reward good behavior even more so. So the contention here is that illness is used to submit others to extortion. And you just have to look at South African politicians to see that that is exactly what they do. They get away from everything by being sick when they need to be in court, when they need to go to jail, all of that. There's massive rewards for being sick. And so by being ill, we can nearly always get things we could never have managed in the absence of the symptoms. So ranging from devotion to attention to sympathy to money to time off to help and control others. And when I work with people who have a lot of symptoms, especially things like headaches and stomach aches and so on, they use those to not have to go to work, not to deal with a problem, not to have to go out with family and friends. And so part of the work is to get them to be assertive about what they need without actually having to feel sick at the same time. So symptoms are seen as instruments of power, and that can get in the way of healing. So we talk about the secondary gain of the illness. And the Simontons definitely found that too. They say illness solves problems in people's lives. It serves as a permission giver by allowing people to engage in behavior they would not normally engage in if they were well. And in fact, I had an example of that this afternoon. Client canceled at short notice. And so for me, it is like, how come your issue now becomes my problem? But they use it to get out of tricky situations. I keep switching here, don't I? I don't want to spend much time on this, just to give you a few examples. This is from Thor Detlefsen, but also for those of you who know Louise Hay or Debbie Shapiro, there are a whole lot of people who work with the actual possible meaning of symptoms and the issues. We basically look at what the function is of the organ. So we very often hear people say things like, I can't stomach this anymore, or it leaves a terrible taste in my mouth, or I can't bear this anymore, it's too heavy, or having to shoulder responsibility. So it's even in our language that we use the body to describe things. And so Detlefsen and others make a list. And so it's pretty much like a dream interpretation. It doesn't necessarily hold for everybody, but it's an interesting starting point. So like, for example, disc problems relate possibly to overburdening. Usually the gallbladder and the liver have to do with things like guilt and bitterness and so on. So the nature of the organ gives hints as to what people are struggling with. And you can imagine the bladder and urinary problems a lot to do with being peed off, or struggling to hold the emotion or control the emotions. The liquids are usually related to emotions quite particularly. This I found really interesting, and very much from way back from the Simontons' work right through to that P&I research journal that I showed you in the beginning. Some of the personality patterns are, for example, always putting other people's needs before one's own, feeling responsible for their feelings. And in fact, Gabor Mate talks about his own relation to his mother, where from having been a young child, he's had to protect her. And even as an adult, he won't tell her that he has a physical problem for not wanting to distress her. This thing about indistinct personality boundaries and lack of assertiveness is a massive problem. And I remember years ago, there was a very interesting workshop here presented by an overseas psychologist by the name of surname Yapko. And he was saying that if he could teach people one thing that would make a dramatic difference in their life, it would be assertiveness. Because then you immediately protect your boundaries. You don't take on more than you need to. You're able to say when things are bothering you. It's a most amazing skill, and people often get a whole lot better when they are able to do that. More or less in line with that, inabilities to speak up for one's own needs, being a bit of a victim. That goodness that Mate refers to comes through very strongly. And in fact, even with things like ALS, the one article that I read was where the nursing staff can say, this isn't a real ALS, the person isn't nice enough. But that same niceness seems to come through very much with the cancer personality as well. Low self-belief, the need to make a good impression, that kind of what will the people think. And then here's the thing that is where people lose the fight, where they lose hope, where they go into a state of repair, helplessness, and giving up. And I want to refer you to Viktor Frankl's work that he wrote up in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, where he was observing the concentration camp victims, and those who had something to live for and who were not giving up made it out, whereas the others who had no hope, felt helpless, had nothing to live for, gave up. Now, this one is widely researched, the lack of closeness with parents as a child, loneliness, has a lot to do with attachment theory. And so the lack of attachment seems to be very much part of the whole childhood adversity issue, leaving some very permanent damage. And then the poor outlets for emotional discharge kind of goes with not being assertive, and in a sense, not being taught how to deal with emotions properly. In some families, only one emotion is allowed. You're only allowed to be angry, and some you're not even allowed to be angry. But I think it's such a huge favor that we can do our children, is to teach them how to recognize an emotion and how to process it appropriately and safely. Some other predisposing factors. We spoke about stress. Obviously, nutrition is hugely important for the biochemical environment. The microbiome is coming up as a very serious factor in immunity, in neurotransmitters, and then the lifestyle components. I'm not going to go into those right now, but just to add them in as pieces of our ever-growing puzzle. And here's the thing about the childhood adversity, which can leave an enduring imprint and long-term dysregulation of stress response systems. And so a lot of work with the experience of having been a child in a certain environment can help to release those traumas. The Simontons say childhood experiences lead to what we call script decision. It's like life decisions about how and what kind of a person I'm going to be, like Gabo Mate did. Then there's usually a series of stressful events, those cumulative stresses that we spoke about, inability to cope with them assertively and fully. No way of changing the rules about how to be, so I just have to be a nice person. I can't say anything or act in my own best interest, feeling trapped and helpless, and then that giving up. So this was something that they observed in a whole series of their clients. Recovery is pretty much the reverse of that. Sometimes the threat or the thought of death brings a permission to act in ways that weren't permissible before. Then the person has to kind of decide, I'm going to be more assertive, I'm going to set my boundaries, I'm going to stop being everybody's doormat. The physical body responds positively, and if one is lucky, you get to a superior emotional and physical health, improved psychological functioning. So that's kind of what we are hoping and aiming for. The exercise I mentioned earlier to channel the stress, and it also stimulates the production of immune cells. We want appropriate psychotherapy to deal with assertiveness, self-care, losses, changes, prospective death. And then the mindfulness. Now, I said earlier that the program that Kabat-Zinn did was basically to help people who had serious health diagnoses, to help them cope with the stress. But in the coping with the stress, they often had amazing physical recovery as well. So and basically what the mindfulness does is it helps the body to get to that switch off, things are safe and you're okay now place. Just a little bit more on that line. Mindfulness is the process of coming to terms with things as they are, and that embodies the process of healing. So the whole essence of mindfulness is to uncritically be where you are. Pretty much also what Eckhart Tolle would have spoken about is the power of now, that acceptance. And once you've accepted the situation, then you can free up your intellect to deal with it in proper ways. So we want to think in terms of wholeness and interconnectedness, and pay attention to all those interactions of the mind, body, and behavior in our efforts to deal with the illness. I really like this little quote. Mindfulness is more than meditation practice that can have profound medical and psychological benefits. It is also a way of life that reveals the gentle and loving wholeness that lies at the heart of our being, even in times of great pain and suffering. So his book, that Full Catastrophe Living, is really very highly recommended. And then the app. You can download it easily from the App Store, and it is a mindfulness and meditation app. It has something like 220,000 free meditations on it. You can also subscribe to certain sections and do all sorts of courses. But the tracks that I want to really recommend for stress are the binaural ones. Now, the binaurals are based on sorting out the brainwave patterns. Now, you may be familiar with the four big groups. There's also a gamma, which we use for focus and study. But basically, the beta brainwaves are the awake ones, where we work, where we think. But if it, in my explanation, revs a bit high in the beta brainwave, very stressed, very frazzled. The alpha is slower than the beta waves. It's kind of a relaxed, calming state, really lovely place for creative work and for some visualization. The theta for deep relaxation, we use that for hypnosis, and then the delta for sleep. Now, you can imagine when one is very frazzled in the beta brainwave range, it is incredibly difficult not just to relax or to meditate, but even more so to sleep. And so these binaural tracks you would listen to with headphones or earbuds, and it puts one wavelength in one ear, another brainwave into the other ear, and then your brain creates the calming brainwave. And so it effectively meditates for you. So the effect that it has on the neuronal pathways would be that you build these pathways, you learn to calm your brain, and in the calming, then the body can do its healing. And then also on Insight Timer, there's quite a lot around polyvagal theory, polyvagal breathing. That's the work of Stephen Porges dealing with trauma and stress. And so some of their breathing tracks are really quite brilliant. So the Insight Timer has a little search function. It keeps record and all sorts of things for you. But basically, you can put into the search function binaural, and a whole lot of binaurals will come up. I personally like Chris Collins a lot. His work is brilliant, but you'll choose the tracks that you like and the timing that you want. And you can just put in polyvagal, and then it brings a whole lot of the stress work out for you as well. And so with that, my last slide, just about done. So just to remind you that Shakespeare said, nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And very much so in the stress space. and in the challenge space. Mindfulness and reserves are key for stress management and then obviously also for healing. And for prevention, I really want to urge the lot of us to create healthy context for ourselves and our families to thrive in, because it's a kind of a as above, so below kind of process. So if the contexts are calm and people can thrive in those contexts, it will affect them physically in a very good way. And we can start the healing by loving and caring for our children from early on. And I think if I had one wish for all of us is to be authentic and not so worried about what other people will think of us, and to use our adult intellect and not to blindly follow authority because we're too scared to do anything else. And so all of those will help us to achieve this mind-body health that we are after. So thank you, people. I'm stopping the share here now.
Thank you, Hannetjie. I've got some comments from the chat saying fascinating lecture. Thank you. I'm certainly, if I look at the cancer patients I've dealt with, and also having had tumors of my own, because I've had a breast and thyroid tumor in the past.
Yeah.
Certainly people who are people pleasers often end up with a lot of resentment. And it's very interesting when you go into the patterns that are common in cancer. Rapiti has commented that people's inability to say no to unreasonable requests from demanding people is often a major cause of one's well-being. And I actually saw somebody on Monday evening who is probably one of the worst people pleasers I've come across. And she's having major health issues. And I so relate to you talking about symptoms. I just wanted to share a screen based on a previous lecture that we gave. And the screen I actually want to look at is how emotions are measured. Now, this comes from our medical organ therapy lecture and our substance use disorder slideshow, which also uses a lot of Gabor Mate's work.
Yeah.
And when you look at the map of consciousness, what we're never taught is that our emotions actually resonate at a frequency which can be measured.
Yes.
So when you're in fear, you're resonating at about 100. And if you're resonating at under 200, your well-being, your mind is going to make your body feel ill.
Yeah. Now, this is the kinesiology that we spoke about. Fascinating stuff.
And I think as medical doctors, we've got so focused on the physical that we haven't even begun to consider the emotional impact of some of what we do. And this is a slide for another partly for the Vic Falls conference. But one of the things we do as doctors is we actually, the moment I know that when I see a tumor on a scan or on a biopsy, I go, oh my goodness, how am I going to tell this patient they've got cancer? Because we also see cancer as synonymous with death, which it really, really isn't. You know, over 2/3 of cancer patients will recover fully, particularly if they change the environment in which they got the cancer, which is not just a disastrous nutritional environment and exposure to lots of toxins. It's actually often a bad psychological environment. So, you know, as doctors, you wouldn't really expect a cancer patient to be smiling and the doctor to be smiling. I had a patient in London once called Alf who sailed through lymphoma treatment because he always had this big smile on his face and he made everybody in the room laugh. And we as doctors perpetuate the stress response by having this, oh my goodness, the patient's going to die. And I'm very briefly going to go through a case history. This is a patient that I've known since 1999. And when he was diagnosed with factor V Leiden and thrombophilia, he took it on board, understood it. It wasn't a death sentence. He got on with life. He became fit. He stopped lots of toxins. He prevented DVT, and he was very positive. Because he was having regular liver ultrasounds, in 2022, they detected a 17-centimeter tumor in his liver and new onset of cirrhosis, and the biopsy showed hepatocellular carcinoma. And a very logical, rational person who understood the clotting cascade better than I did just descended into total, oh my goodness, I've got cancer. And I really think we need to be aware. Now, the advantage of this patient was there were such delays in treatment that he saw Dr. Stephen Schmidt, and I spent 2 hours on a call where Stephen said, cancer doesn't kill you if it hasn't metastasized. You have no metastasis. You have a manageable condition. You have a low-grade tumor, and there's no need to panic. And he totally settled. And the important part of the history is that the tumor shrunk from 17 centimeters to 3 centimeters on a ketogenic diet, some very safe repurposed drugs, and selenium and tocotrienol. And what happened then was that the allopathic prestigious doctors got hold of him, saw him only as a liver in a liver cancer clinic, suggested a liver transplant, which, given the fact he had portal vein thrombosis and had huge collaterals, we already knew. And Stephen said to him, whatever you do, don't go for surgery, because angels rush or fools rush in where angels dare to tread. He then developed MRSA. They opened him, closed him, didn't do the liver transplant, and he very nearly died, and he has significant residual post-op pain. He's continued on holistic care, and the tumor continues to shrink and is completely contained. And he's reverted back to people who actually see cancer as something you can live with, which is manageable. So I really would reiterate everything you've said: nutrition, stress, the environment you live in. We as primary care doctors need to be the person who supports a cancer patient through their illness and treats the multifaceted portion of it, instead of just writing a referral to an oncologist.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it at that. And we need to get away from the scary word cancer, because cancer is a treatable condition.
Yeah. Jackie, there was a question that absolutely fascinated me that I thought about this morning. And this is that there are so many turbo cancers now. And I was wondering what triggered. So we obviously know what happened in the environment, but I also think that we probably have more so those psychological factors in the people who took the jabs. And so they're into being much more adapted, not trusting their own judgment. And it seems that goes together with the assault on the immune system and then relating to those hectic turbo cancers. What would you say?
Look, I've just popped a slide on the screen on fear. And certainly for myself, once, when I had a breast lump, I stopped the toxins, which was YAS, or hormone replacement therapy.
Yeah.
And then when I got the thyroid lump, which was borderline cancerous, I completely changed my lifestyle. I went keto, I reduced my stress, but I had, my youngest was 9 in the first tumor and 15 with the second tumor, and I needed to fight. So at no point did I entertain the fact that I was going to be scared of this. I had the surgical excision done, and I got on with detoxing my life.
Yeah.
And I think that people who take control, as you say, it's amazing how many people live until the wedding is over, or their child flies in from overseas to say goodbye, and they hang in right till the end, and then they almost make a decision to exit.
Yeah.
And I think we've never basically done research on why the placebo effect is 30%. Obviously, our minds are hugely able to contain disease,
Yeah.
and our minds are able to cause these miracle cures, and our minds are also able to kill us.
Yeah.
I distinctly remember when I was younger, one of the staff working for my grandmother was told that they were going to die in 5 days, and they did.
Yeah.
Okay.
But now
So,
that placebo thing is quite nicely researched by the P&I people, hey? They find that the positive belief triggers a whole lot of positive things in the body, kind of counteracts the stress.
yeah,
So like your body follows where your beliefs go, hey?
absolutely. And I work quite closely with the pastor of Highlands Presby. I see quite a lot of his patients who need palliative care or who've got mental health problems. He actually is no longer the pastor of Highlands Presby because he refused to preach according to what he was told to preach. But that's another story. And he's a huge believer in that your mind can completely determine an outcome.
Yeah.
And one of the things he said recently that, and in fact, he referred me the girl I saw on Monday night. He basically says it says 365 times in the Bible, "Thou shalt not fear," and
Yeah.
it's not a suggestion; it's a command.
Yeah.
And I think that people who I think the fear mongering that has occurred in the medical world, and we've really noticed it over the last 4 years, but it's been going on for decades. Fear is a very good way to market. And now that I'm
Oh,
in the
yes.
pharmaceutical industry, I see
Yeah.
how it's utilized. And I think
Absolutely.
as doctors, we mustn't perpetuate fear. And as healthcare providers, we mustn't perpetuate fear. We need to see a holistic model, and we need to be the bringers of positivity and hope, not the bringers of gloom, doom, and referral plans.
I just want to say something about the thou shalt not. It's one of the quirks of the subconscious is it doesn't really understand no and don't. So if you say don't be afraid, the thing that's in your mind is fear. So you have to say be brave, be positive, look on the bright side, whatever. Makes a massive difference the way that you frame the thing. So it's the same as saying I'm not going to smoke. The thing that you're thinking about is smoking. So one needs to reframe it to get away completely from the thing that you don't want.
And I'd agree with that 100%. And personally, one of the things that happens when I get into a negative mindset at the bottom, I mean, I've learned so much from Martin Wilker on some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, he does a master's degree. He wrote and lectures in a master's degree in functional medicine.
Yes.
And one of the things that I personally do if I get angry, which has happened quite a lot in the last 4 years, or if I end up in any of the negative emotions,
Yeah.
I actually have to get out of it, not by focusing on the negative emotion, but
Yeah.
by defaulting to reason.
Yes.
So that's why I will get on a call to somebody who's in the SAVMS group or who kind of thinks on my wavelength, and I'll have a discussion, and particularly getting out of yourself. So you
Yes.
focus on someone else's problem, and then you speak to someone who operates on reason, and you're able to take yourself out of a negative state, but you only can do it by focusing on doing something, preferably that doesn't allow you to wallow in your own
Yes.
misery, which a lot
Yes.
of patients do with the victim mindset.
Yeah.
And you need to get out of yourself and help someone else with no intention of benefiting from that. And the other thing that's very powerful is to find what your passion is. I've
Yeah.
got one patient whose passion is art. When she's getting into a state of despair, she does have a medical problem, she will paint, and that's
Yeah.
her release. For me, it's very often doing a PowerPoint presentation
Yeah.
because I have to default to reason. and get out of these negative mindsets. So definitely the subconscious mind thinks in images. If I say to you, don't think of a cat, stop thinking of the cat, But if I say, think of a zebra, think of a giraffe, think of an elephant, think of Victoria Falls, think of a baobab, the cat is gone because you've replaced it with other images. And I think we've totally underrated the importance of psychology in cancer. And I think that the CBT kind of, sorry, we're getting an echo. I think the CBT kind of route needs to be looked at. I think at getting patients to focus on a neuro-linguistic programming kind of way out of misery is very important. It's what I've seen work.
Yes, quite. Well,
so thank you for that. We're already 15 minutes over our time. I'm going to go back into the chat. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to go back into the chat and just see if anybody else has any comments. And yeah, this is where the technology, here we go. I don't think anybody's, so Dr. Rapiti said, Lincoln said, happiness is a state of mind and a choice. I 100% agree with that. A lot of people choose to be unhappy. One of the interesting things the pastor I work with says is that many people look for novelty and stimulation. So when they're in a creative state of mind, they're great. And then people say relax, and they can't actually go into a zero state of mind. So they would rather be stimulated by catastrophic negative thinking than they would be to chill. So to get out of catastrophic negative thinking, you need to choose to think logically and to get out, to know what gets you out of that state. So Dr. Rapiti, I agree 100%. Helen Muir said, what an amazing lecture, Hannetjie. You managed to make it readily accessible for those of us with no psychology training. So thank you for that. Okay. And there's, this is a very big question. What are particular illnesses or diseases directly caused by stress? And in my experience, it's cardiovascular disease and cancer are very high up on that. I don't know what your opinion is.
I think there are many. I think most, I'm thinking of skin problems and eczemas and psoriasis and arthritis and all of those. They all seem to be related to stress and the effect on the body. But what I can say is that there are two things for me that I can think of now influence. It would be very much the language in your family. And then the other is the particular sensitivity of your physical being. So you may have a genetic predisposition for something, and it's the weakest links that go first. So that's why people are so different, but it's quite specific for this body that the weakest links go first.
So 100%. Dr. Petey's also commented that doctors are in an ideal position to allow patients to vent and express themselves, and I do agree with that. There's also been a comment that most of the recent cancer patients have been associated with taking COVID vaccines. I will personally agree that the 3 people that I have seen, one of which who is now passed, was temporarily completely related to the injection. And one of the things that Stephen Schmidt has said is that the playing field has changed. Before, people who lived a very healthy lifestyle would often have a lot of longevity, whereas people who've had the vaccine, certainly in the case of my liver tumor patient, he lived the perfect lifestyle. And the moment he was injected, he developed a turbo cancer. So I think that, yes, I think that it's a combination of the immune suppression and the immune dysregulation. I spoke to somebody recently, and I asked him to explain he's a public health physician, and I said, can you explain to me why injecting the code for a foreign protein that will be expressed on my child's own cells is a good idea, because for me, it's a recipe for autoimmune disease and endothelial dysfunction. And I didn't say another word, and he basically talked himself into the fact that treatment should be individualized and we should be giving patients choice. So yes, I think it's a major factor. It's one of the reasons for the Vic Falls conference is that we are seeing cancers rocket all over the globe. The WHO is saying that 30% of people by 2030 will have a cancer diagnosis. And that's partly due to the environmental toxins, the obesity, the smoking, everything else that's happening, our toxic, stressful lifestyles. And on top of that, we're giving injections that will suppress our immune surveillance system, which is our only defense against cancer, really.
Yeah. The thing, to me, it feels as if the jabs took the brakes off processes in the body. And people who may have had the beginnings of a small cancer, and now there's just a flood of negative things. But I'd be very interested to see in the research coming out going forward around the mindset of people in the pandemic, because we remember we had that lecture about the psyops that the British psychologist spoke about, that the government employed to absolutely terrify people, not just frighten, terrify. And so I think all of those techniques have had a very bad negative cumulative effect on people who were already stressed. And then the masks and the isolation and the financial despair, it just is an overload to the system.
Yeah. And I think what you said right at the beginning is it's multifaceted.
Yes.
And we've also got to get out of this dichotomous, was it this or was it that? It was probably both,
Yes.
you know?
Yes.
So was it just the injections or was it the mindset? It was probably both, because people went ahead with an experimental injection because of the fear.
Yeah.
So it was almost the perfect storm.
Yeah.
There's a question on HRT. What are the natural non-toxic options? And the natural non-toxic options are bioidentical hormones. And I've researched this heavily because of my own experience. So the artificial estrogens and the progestogens, which are MPA, methylprogesterone and acetate, those actually increase something called sex hormone binding globulin, and they are known to be carcinogenic, and that's been clearly documented. Whereas the bioidentical hormones, which include Femigel, which is given transdermally, and bioidentical progesterone, also known as Eutrogestin, do not and are probably protective against cancer. So the big blanket of HRT, there are three kinds of estrogen. One is carcinogenic, one is not. It's estradiol is what young women produce, and E3 is protective. So we can't just put everything in HRT under the same blanket. And Erica Drews has done a very good presentation on the fact that we should not be going with the Women's Health Initiative, which makes all HRT scary. It's a whole lecture on itself. But certainly the bioidenticals are protective.
Yeah.
So Dr. Shanae did a brilliant presentation, and thank you for that. And I would agree with that. Hannetjie, another comment is high dose vitamin D. I've certainly seen patients turn around in terms of having severe COVID, long COVID, and in terms of cancer when you give high dose vitamin D. And when I say high dose, injectable 300,000 units. And Dr. DeMello in India gives 600,000 units. And it's not a vitamin, it's a hormone. And it's a massive immune booster. There's I've got a whole lecture just on vitamin D. Laughter therapy, very effective to overcome cancer. I've certainly seen that with ALF in the cancer wards. All those patients did much better. Strong family support has come up. And then again, against connection is 3 years of lockdown and isolation will have a major negative impact on society as a whole. And I agree with that 100%.
Just one interesting little thing. Being able to hug somebody releases oxytocin in your system. And that is one of the antidotes against stress. Now, we were forbidden to come near anybody. People in the same household weren't even hugging and connecting with each other. So that perfect storm has tentacles spreading very far.
Well, hopefully we've become alerted to it and we can get a much more holistic way of managing cancer other than referring to the allopathic model, which, well, the surgery, certainly debulking surgery, I've seen work. Radiotherapy, if it's targeted, I've seen work. Paul Merrick has just put out a post on Twitter basically saying that chemotherapy is illogical because you're destroying the very system that contains the cancer, which is the immune system. And a patient of mine who died in October last year and he developed his cancer after injections. He went very rapidly downhill with chemo. And I think that's the jury is still out on chemotherapy, given that there are so many other holistic methods that boost the immune system that also contain the tumor.
So, thank you.
Good. Well, thank you. I'm going to end it there. We are almost an hour, and I have staff who are running the tech downstairs who I know need to get home because the road's got roadworks at the moment. And it's a nightmare with traffic. So thank you, everybody, and wonderful talk, Hannetjie. And I'm looking forward to hearing your lectures in Vic Falls on managing mental health.
Good. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.